6 weeks after my father died, a woman named Christine Halloway sent our family attorney a notarized letter claiming to be my father's biological daughter, conceived during a brief affair 38 years earlier, and demanding her legally entitled share of his $3.1 million estate. She had a birth certificate. She had photographs, allegedly of my father from decades earlier, that did bear a genuine, unsettling resemblance to old pictures I'd seen of him as a young man. She had a notarized affidavit from a woman claiming to be a friend of her deceased mother, corroborating the affair. She had, by every appearance, exactly the kind of documentation that makes an estate attorney sit up straight and start taking a claim seriously. She did not have a father. My father never had an affair 38 years ago or at any other point in his 39-year marriage to my mother. Christine Halloway was, as I would spend the next 5 months proving through a private investigator, a forensic genealogist, and a DNA laboratory, a professional imposter. A woman who had done this, under different names, to at least 3 other grieving families before mine, each time targeting a recently deceased man with a substantial estate and no surviving spouse to immediately, instinctively recognize the claim as an obvious lie. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, and sometimes, as this story will show you, wars launched from entirely outside the family, by someone who understands exactly how to make a lie look like the truth. Today's story is called The Sister Who Wasn't. Let's begin. My name is Rebecca Sorensen. I'm 42 years old. I work as a corporate attorney in Minneapolis, and my father, Harold Sorensen, died 8 months ago at the age of 74, following a brief, aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer that gave our family barely 3 months from diagnosis to his death, enough time to say goodbye, but not enough time to feel remotely prepared for the specific, disorienting grief of actually losing him. My father built a successful commercial insurance brokerage over a 40-year career, growing a small, single-office operation he founded in his late 20s into a regional firm with offices across 3 states, eventually selling his controlling interest to a larger national brokerage roughly a decade before his death, in a transaction that left him, alongside decades of careful, conservative investing, with an estate worth, at his death, just over $3.1 million. My father was, I want to say clearly and without hesitation, a devoted, faithful husband to my mother, Carol, for their entire 39-year marriage, right up until her own death, 4 years before his, from complications related to a long battle with rheumatoid arthritis. I say this not defensively, but because it becomes directly, legally relevant to everything that follows. I had, and have, no genuine uncertainty whatsoever about my father's fidelity throughout his marriage. My parents' relationship was, by every account I have direct, lived knowledge of, and by the consistent, corroborating accounts of their closest friends across 4 decades, a genuinely close, loving, and faithful partnership. My father's estate, following his death, was to be divided, per his carefully updated will, between me and my younger brother, David, in equal shares. A straightforward, uncomplicated distribution that, under ordinary circumstances, should have resolved within the standard, predictable timeline of routine Minnesota probate administration. The letter arrived at our family attorney's office. A probate specialist named Frank DeLuca, who had handled my father's estate planning for over 15 years, roughly 6 weeks after my father's funeral, still well within the period our family was navigating the raw, disorienting early stages of grief, made only slightly more manageable by the practical, familiar rhythms of handling necessary paperwork and administrative tasks. Frank called me directly, his voice carrying an unusual, careful tension I hadn't heard from him before, in 15 years of an otherwise straightforward professional relationship. "Rebecca, I need you to sit down for this," he said. I've received a formal claim against your father's estate from a woman named Christine Halloway, claiming to be his biological daughter, conceived during what she describes as a brief affair with your father in 1987, roughly 2 years before you were born. She's asserting a legal claim to an equal share of the estate as a previously unacknowledged child. I remember, distinctly, the specific, disorienting quality of that moment, not immediate anger, not even immediate disbelief, but a strange, floating confusion, the sensation of trying to fit an entirely foreign, unfamiliar piece into a picture of my family's history that had felt, until that exact phone call, completely stable and known. That's not possible, I told Frank. My parents were together their entire marriage. My father wasn't the kind of man who would have done that, and even setting aside what kind of man he was, I would have known. My mother would have known. Someone would have known, at some point across nearly 40 years, if this were actually true. I understand your reaction, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying I believe this claim is legitimate, Frank said. But I do need to tell you what she submitted, because under Minnesota probate law, a claim like this, if it includes sufficiently credible supporting documentation, does require formal investigation and response before the estate can be fully distributed and closed. I can't simply dismiss it without a proper process, even if my instinct, like yours, is skepticism. Frank forwarded me the full package of documentation Christine Halloway's own attorney had submitted alongside her formal claim, and I want to walk through what it actually contained, because I think understanding the specific, careful construction of a fraudulent claim like this is genuinely instructive for anyone watching this who might someday face something similar. The package included a birth certificate for a Christine Halloway, born in October 1987 in Rochester, Minnesota, listing a mother named Patricia Halloway, and, in the space for the father's name, simply unknown. A birth certificate, that was. Frank confirmed through his own verification with Minnesota Vital Records, entirely genuine and authentic, corresponding to a real birth that had genuinely occurred. It included a series of photographs, allegedly depicting my father and Patricia Halloway together, at what appeared to be a work conference in Rochester in early 1987. Photographs that, I want to be honest, gave me a genuine, unsettling jolt of uncertainty the first time I saw them, since one did appear to show a man bearing a real resemblance to old photographs I'd seen of my father from that general era. Standing alongside an unfamiliar woman at what looked like a hotel conference space. It included a notarized affidavit from a woman named Susan Meyerhoff, describing herself as Patricia Halloway's close friend during the relevant period, corroborating that Patricia had told her, at the time, about a brief affair with a married insurance executive named Harold Sorensen, and that Patricia had confided in her, before Patricia's own death 11 years earlier, about the child's true, unacknowledged parentage. And it included a written narrative from Christine herself, describing a childhood spent wondering about her biological father's identity, her mother's reluctance to discuss the details until shortly before her death, and her own recent decision, following extensive personal research prompted by her mother's late-life partial disclosures, to finally locate, and upon learning of Harold Sorensen's recent death, formally assert her legal claim to what she described as her rightful inheritance as his previously unacknowledged daughter. I sat with that entire package, alone, in my home office, for several hours, feeling something I can only describe as a specific, vertiginous instability, not fully believing the claim, but no longer able to dismiss it with the complete, immediate certainty I'd felt during my first phone call with Frank. I called David, my brother, immediately after reviewing the package, and our shared initial reaction, working through the documentation together over the phone, helped restore some of the grounded skepticism the raw, unfamiliar photographs had briefly shaken loose. Dad wasn't even working with clients in Rochester in early 1987, David pointed out, pulling up an old employment timeline he happened to still have saved from a prior, unrelated matter years earlier related to Dad's original business incorporation paperwork. His territory, at that point in his career, was entirely the Twin Cities metro area. He didn't start expanding into the Rochester market until the early 1990s, well after this alleged conference would have happened. This was a small, specific, verifiable inconsistency, not conclusive on its own, since memories and old business records can certainly contain errors or gaps, but enough to meaningfully shift my confidence back toward genuine, grounded skepticism rather than the unsettled uncertainty Christine's photographs had briefly produced. I also, working alongside David, and eventually a private investigator we retained, began examining the photographs themselves more carefully. The man in the photographs, while bearing a real, undeniable general resemblance to my father, was on closer, more careful examination alongside verified authentic photographs of my father from the same general period, subtly but genuinely different in several specific respects. A slightly different jawline, a hairline that receded in a different pattern, details that, taken individually, might be dismissed as simply how photographs sometimes distort or how memory of a resemblance can overstate itself. But that, taken together, suggested something considerably more deliberate than a genuine, if unlikely, family resemblance. David and I, working with Frank's recommendation, retained a private investigator named Rosalind Kemper, who specialized specifically in what she described, during our initial consultation, as inheritance fraud and imposter heir cases. A category of fraud, she explained, that had grown considerably in recent years, driven partly by the increasing accessibility of genealogy research tools and document fabrication technology, and partly by a specific, exploitable pattern in how grieving families, disoriented by loss and unfamiliar with probate law's actual requirements, often respond to claims like Christine's with more initial uncertainty than a fully composed, non-grieving family might. I want to walk you through how this specific type of fraud typically works, Rosalind told us during our first meeting, because understanding the mechanics will help you understand exactly what we need to investigate and disprove. A professional imposter heir typically identifies a target, usually a recently deceased individual with a substantial, verifiable estate, ideally without a surviving spouse who would immediately, instinctively know a claimed affair never happened. They construct a plausible narrative and gather or fabricate supporting documentation, sometimes using a real birth certificate belonging to an actual person with an unknown or absent father, which they then falsely connect to the target's identity through fabricated corroborating evidence. The goal is rarely to survive a full, rigorous DNA-based legal proceeding. The goal is typically to create just enough uncertainty and just enough documentation to pressure a grieving, disoriented family into a quiet, negotiated settlement. A payment to make the claim go away, priced below what a full legal fight would cost, and calibrated specifically to exploit the family's desire to avoid a prolonged, public, emotionally exhausting dispute during an already difficult period of grief. I want to pause here and note something important. Rosalind's description, hearing it for the first time, produced in me a specific, clarifying anger that, I think, marked the real turning point in how I approached this entire ordeal. The recognition that whatever Christine Halloway's actual, specific history turned out to be, the fundamental structure of what she was doing was a calculated exploitation of grief itself. Banking specifically on my family's exhaustion and disorientation to extract a payment neither David nor I actually owed her. Rosalind's investigation began with Susan Meyerhoff, the woman whose notarized affidavit corroborated Christine's account of her mother's alleged affair with my father. Locating and independently investigating Susan turned out to be considerably more difficult than Rosalind had initially anticipated. Given that the affidavit itself listed only a post office box address in a different Minnesota city, with no additional independently verifiable contact information beyond what Christine's attorney had provided. Rosalind's investigation, over several weeks, eventually traced the post office box to a mail forwarding service, and through a combination of records requests and careful, patient tracing, ultimately connected Susan Meyerhoff to a woman with an entirely different legal name, a woman with a documented history, under at least 2 prior aliases Rosalind was able to confirm, of providing paid, fabricated corroborating testimony in at least 2 prior civil matters entirely unrelated to my father's estate, a pattern of professional false testimony for hire that, once documented, fundamentally undermined the entire evidentiary foundation Christine's claim had rested on. This is the single most damaging finding in this entire investigation, Rosalind told us, once this connection was confirmed. A notarized affidavit from a corroborating witness is powerful evidence, specifically because it carries the legal weight and presumed seriousness of sworn testimony. Once we can demonstrate that this particular witness has a documented, provable history of providing false, paid testimony under multiple aliases in unrelated matters, the entire credibility of her corroboration collapses, and with it, a significant portion of what made Christine's claim initially appear credible enough to require serious investigation in the first place. Rosalind next turned her investigation toward the photographs, retaining a forensic photo analyst, a specialist named Gordon Chu who worked regularly with law enforcement agencies on digital and physical image authentication cases. Gordon's analysis, conducted over several weeks, revealed that the photographs, while genuinely old and genuinely depicting real events from the 1980s, had been digitally altered in ways not immediately apparent to an untrained observer. Specifically, Gordon's analysis identified subtle, technically sophisticated evidence of facial compositing, in which the actual face of a different man, present in the original, genuine photograph, had been carefully replaced with a face constructed to closely resemble my father, using a combination of digital manipulation techniques, and, Gordon's report noted, likely reference images of my father that would have been publicly accessible through his professional insurance brokerage's marketing materials and industry publications from that same general era. This is considerably more sophisticated than an amateur attempt, Gordon told us, presenting his findings. Whoever produced these images had access to genuine period photography to use as a base, understood how to source and integrate reference images of your father specifically, and executed the compositing with enough technical skill that it would very likely pass casual, untrained inspection, which, I suspect, was precisely the level of scrutiny they were counting on most grieving families to apply. This finding, combined with Susan Meyerhoff's documented history of fabricated testimony, transformed the entire shape of our investigation. We were no longer investigating an unlikely but potentially genuine family secret. We were investigating a deliberately, professionally constructed fraud. Rosalind's continued investigation, now armed with considerably stronger evidence of deliberate fraud, expanded to examine Christine Halloway's own background more thoroughly, working, at this stage, in close coordination with Frank's legal team, since the evidence had grown serious enough to warrant preparing for potential criminal referral alongside the civil probate dispute. What Rosalind found was that Christine Halloway, while using her genuine legal name and genuine, authentic birth certificate, the actual documented child of a real woman named Patricia Halloway, born to an unknown father in 1987, exactly as the birth certificate itself accurately reflected, had, over the preceding 12 years, filed at least 3 prior, strikingly similar inheritance claims against the estates of other recently deceased men with substantial, verifiable wealth, in each case constructing a narrative of a decades-old affair with her actual, genuinely unknown biological father, adapted and fabricated to match whichever specific target she had most recently identified. 2 of those 3 prior claims, Rosalind's investigation revealed, had resulted in confidential settlements. Families who, facing exactly the kind of grief-driven exhaustion and desire to avoid prolonged, public dispute that Rosalind had described in our initial consultation, had ultimately agreed to pay Christine a negotiated sum, considerably smaller than a full estate share, but still substantial, simply to make the claim. And the associated legal costs and emotional strain disappear. The 3rd prior claim, Rosalind discovered, had actually proceeded to a formal DNA testing requirement, at which point Christine had abruptly withdrawn the claim entirely rather than submit to testing that would have definitively, immediately disproven her asserted parentage. This last detail became, once confirmed, one of the single most useful pieces of strategic information in our own case, because it suggested, strongly, that Christine's entire operating model depended specifically on families settling before reaching the point of definitive DNA verification, and that a family willing and prepared to push directly and immediately toward that testing, rather than negotiating around it, would very likely see the claim collapse entirely. Exactly as it had in that 3rd, previously withdrawn case, Frank, working with Rosalind's findings, formally responded to Christine's claim by immediately, directly requesting court-ordered DNA testing to definitively establish or disprove the asserted biological relationship. A request that, given Minnesota probate law's clear provisions for exactly this kind of paternity-based inheritance dispute, the court granted without significant complication or delay. I want to describe the specific, tense period of waiting that followed that court order, because even with Rosalind's substantial evidence of fraud already assembled, the fabricated corroborating witness, the digitally altered photographs, the pattern of prior similar claims, some small, persistent part of me still carried an uneasy uncertainty until the actual definitive scientific result was in hand. Fraud investigations, however strong the circumstantial and forensic evidence, don't carry quite the same absolute, unambiguous certainty that a DNA test itself provides. And I found myself, during those weeks of waiting, unable to fully relax into the confidence Rosalind's findings should have reasonably provided. Christine's attorney, once the DNA testing order was formalized, requested a 30-day extension before compliance, citing, in his filing, Christine's need to gather appropriate medical accommodation given health considerations. A vague, unsubstantiated justification that Frank characterized, in our own response, as consistent with a pattern of delay tactics rather than any genuine medical necessity. The court granted a brief, considerably shorter extension than requested. Christine, roughly 2 weeks before the newly imposed deadline, formally withdrew her claim against my father's estate entirely, through a brief, procedural filing that offered no explanation and made no admission of the fraud, simply stating that she was no longer pursuing the asserted claim. The withdrawal, while it resolved the immediate threat to my father's estate, did not, on its own, hold Christine accountable for what Rosalind's investigation had established was a deliberate, sophisticated, and repeated pattern of fraud against grieving families. Frank, David, and I made the decision, working with Rosalind's fully documented findings, to formally refer the matter to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, alongside sharing our investigation's findings with the two families whose prior settlements Rosalind had identified, who, once contacted, expressed a mixture of vindication, and in both cases, a renewed willingness to formally cooperate with a criminal investigation, now that they understood their own prior experience had been part of a documented, repeated pattern rather than an isolated incident. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office, reviewing the combined evidence, Rosalind's investigation, Gordon's forensic photo analysis, the documented pattern of Susan Meyerhoff's fabricated testimony under multiple aliases, and the corroborating accounts from the two prior settled families, ultimately filed felony fraud charges against Christine Halloway, encompassing both my father's estate, and once the additional victim's cooperation was secured, the two prior successful claims as well. I want to be honest that the criminal case, as of the recording of this video, remains in progress, moving through the specific, often frustratingly slow timeline of felony fraud prosecution, and I'm limited, per Frank's advice, in how much detail I can share about its current specific status while it remains active. What I can share is that the evidence assembled through this investigation, evidence that very nearly never existed at all, had David, and I simply followed the path of least resistance and quietly settled. The way at least two prior families had now provides Hennepin County prosecutors with a considerably stronger foundation for accountability than either of those two prior, unresolved cases had ever achieved on their own. I want to spend real time here on the two families whose prior settlements Rosalind's investigation uncovered, because connecting with them became one of the most meaningful, if painful, parts of this entire ordeal for me. The first family, the Hendricksons, had settled with Christine roughly 6 years earlier, following the death of their own father, a successful commercial real estate developer in the Twin Cities. Their experience, once I spoke with the surviving daughter, Diane Hendrickson, at length, mirrored my own family's experience with striking, uncomfortable precision. The same general narrative structure, the same category of fabricated corroborating documentation, the same calculated pressure toward a quiet, negotiated resolution rather than a full legal fight. We were only 4 months out from losing our father when her claim arrived, Diane told me, during a long, emotional phone call roughly a month into our own investigation. None of us had the energy for a prolonged fight. Our attorney told us at the time that settling was probably the pragmatic choice, given the cost of fully litigating and disproving the claim versus what she was asking for. I've regretted that decision every year since, wondering whether settling just meant she'd do the exact same thing to some other grieving family. I told Diane, once our own investigation had progressed far enough to confirm it definitively, that her fear had in fact been realized, that Christine had indeed targeted at least 2 more families, including my own, in the years since the Hendricksons' settlement. Diane's reaction, hearing that confirmation, was a specific, complicated mixture of grief and a kind of grim, vindicated resolve. I want to help however I can now, she told me. I should have pushed harder back then. Maybe if I had, this wouldn't have kept happening to other families. I told Diane, as honestly as I could, exactly what I've tried to tell everyone in this entire story who has expressed some version of retrospective guilt about not fighting harder or noticing sooner. That Christine's entire scheme was specifically designed to exploit exactly the kind of grief-driven exhaustion the Hendricksons were experiencing at the time, and that the fault for the scheme's continuation belonged entirely to the person who deliberately, repeatedly exploited that vulnerability, not to any individual family's understandably human response to it. In the specific, disoriented moment, they were forced to make that decision. The second family, whose identity I'll protect more carefully at their own explicit request, given ongoing sensitivities related to the active criminal case, had settled with Christine roughly 3 years earlier, following the death of a successful manufacturing business owner in suburban Minneapolis. Their experience added an additional, useful detail to our overall investigation. They had, at the time of Christine's claim, briefly considered pursuing DNA testing themselves, only to be persuaded against it by their own attorney at the time, who had advised them, based on the apparent strength of the documentation Christine presented, that pursuing a full legal fight carried genuine litigation risk and cost that made a modest, negotiated settlement the more prudent, pragmatic path. This detail, once shared with Rosalind and Frank, became a useful, cautionary data point in our own strategic planning. A reminder that even well-intentioned, competent legal advice, working from an incomplete picture of a claim's underlying fraudulent construction, can sometimes counsel toward exactly the kind of quiet settlement that allows a scheme like Christine's to continue, undetected and unaccountable, for years longer than it otherwise would. "I think the lesson here," Frank told David and me, once we'd gathered this fuller picture across all 3 prior targeted families, "is that any family facing a claim like this should always at least strongly consider pushing directly toward the most definitive, unambiguous form of verification available, DNA testing. In a paternity-based claim like this, before accepting the premise that a negotiated settlement is automatically the more pragmatic path, settlements make sense in situations with genuine, irreducible uncertainty. They make considerably less sense when a claim's underlying truth or falsehood can be definitively, scientifically resolved, provided the family is willing to withstand the delay and discomfort of actually pursuing that resolution rather than settling around it. I want to share something more personal here, because I think it's an important, honest part of processing this entire ordeal. My mother, Carol, died 4 years before my father, after their 39 years of what I've always understood, and what every close friend and family member across 4 decades has consistently corroborated to be a genuinely devoted, faithful marriage. Throughout this entire investigation, even as I understood, intellectually and with mounting confidence, that Christine's claim was fraudulent, I found myself carrying a specific, uncomfortable grief on my mother's behalf, imagining, even hypothetically, even while actively disproving it, what it would have meant for her, had she lived to see this claim arrive, to have her marriage's fidelity publicly questioned in exactly this way, during a period when she would have also been grieving my father's death. I raised this once with David during a difficult conversation midway through our investigation. "I keep thinking about how furious Mom would have been," I told him. "Not scared, not uncertain the way I sometimes felt looking at those photographs. Furious. She would have known, instantly and completely, that this was a lie because she knew Dad, and she knew their marriage in a way that even we, as their children, only partially have access to." David agreed, and I think that specific, grounding thought, imagining my mother's instant, unwavering certainty, became, for both of us, a useful anchor throughout the more disorienting stretches of the investigation, a reminder that our own occasional uncertainty, looking at fabricated photographs or reading a persuasively constructed narrative, reflected the sophistication of Christine's fraud rather than any genuine, underlying truth to what she was claiming. I want to spend a little time considering Christine Halloway herself, not to excuse or minimize what she did, which I want to be unambiguous, was a deliberate, sophisticated, repeated fraud that caused genuine harm to multiple grieving families. But because I think understanding, as much as the available information allows, who she actually is adds an important dimension to this story that I don't want to flatten into pure, uncomplicated villainy. Rosalind's investigation, in the course of tracing Christine's background, revealed that she had, in fact, genuinely never known her biological father's identity. The birth certificate's listing of unknown reflected, as far as Rosalind could determine, a genuine, real gap in Christine's own family history, not a fabrication. Patricia Halloway, Christine's actual mother, had died when Christine was 23, apparently without ever resolving or disclosing whatever the true circumstances of Christine's conception had actually been. I don't know, and I don't think anyone beyond Christine herself fully knows, what specific combination of genuine, unresolved grief about her own unknown parentage and calculated, criminal opportunism eventually led her toward constructing these fraudulent claims against a series of unrelated, deceased men. I want to be careful not to offer some falsely sympathetic psychological narrative I have no genuine basis for constructing. What I can say, with confidence, based on the evidence Rosalind assembled, is that whatever combination of motivations underlay Christine's actions, she pursued them with a level of sophistication, patience, and repeated, deliberate targeting of multiple grieving families that moves well beyond any reasonable characterization as a single, sympathetic lapse in judgment, into something considerably more calculated and, ultimately, considerably more harmful. My father's estate, following Christine's formal withdrawal of her claim, proceeded to closure roughly 10 months after his death, considerably longer than the straightforward, uncomplicated timeline our family had originally anticipated, but ultimately resolved exactly as his carefully drafted will had always intended, divided equally between David and me. I want to describe what it felt like, finally receiving Frank's call confirming the estate's formal closure, because it carried a specific, complicated weight beyond simple relief. Part of me felt, genuinely, a kind of exhausted satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of having refused to let a calculated, exploitative fraud succeed against my own grieving family, the way it had, unaccountably, succeeded against at least 2 families before us. But another part of me felt, and still feels, a lingering grief that this entire ordeal had to happen at all, that the final 10 months of processing my father's death, months that should have been devoted entirely to grief, to remembering him, to the ordinary, necessary work of learning to live in a world he was no longer part of, had instead been substantially consumed by forensic photo analysis, private investigation reports, and the specific, exhausting work of proving a negative against a stranger's calculated lie. Your father would be proud of how you and David handled this, Frank told me during that final closure call. A lot of families in your position would have simply paid to make it go away. You didn't just protect the estate. You did something that might actually stop her from doing this to another family. Since this case became somewhat known within Minnesota's estate planning and probate law community, following the criminal referral and the resulting local legal press coverage, I've been approached by several other families, either currently facing or worried about facing a similar fraudulent claim, asking for guidance based on our own experience. The advice I now consistently give, informed by everything Rosalind, Frank, and Gordon taught me throughout this ordeal, centers on a few specific, practical principles. First, take any claim seriously enough to properly investigate it, but resist the instinct to immediately, reflexively negotiate a settlement simply to make an uncomfortable, grief-compounding dispute disappear. That instinct, however understandable, is exactly what schemes like Christine's are specifically designed to exploit. Second, push directly and promptly toward the most definitive form of verification available for the specific type of claim you're facing. DNA testing for a paternity-based inheritance claim, forensic document or photo analysis for claims resting on physical documentation, independent verification of any corroborating witnesses' backgrounds and credibility. Third, understand that a family's grief and exhaustion, while completely legitimate and human, should not be allowed to become the deciding factor in how seriously and thoroughly a claim gets investigated. Bring in professional support, whether a specialized attorney, a private investigator, or both, specifically because grief genuinely does compromise a family's own capacity for the kind of clear-eyed, sustained scrutiny a fraudulent claim requires to properly unravel. And finally, if you do discover, through this kind of investigation, that a claim against your family was fraudulent, seriously consider pursuing formal accountability. A criminal referral, a civil fraud claim, whatever legal avenues are available, rather than simply relieved relief once the immediate threat to your own estate has passed. Christine Halloway had already successfully targeted 2 families before mine, and I have to believe, had either of those prior families pursued the kind of formal accountability David and I ultimately did, at least one grieving family somewhere down that eventual timeline, quite possibly my own, might have been spared this entire ordeal altogether. For every family facing a claim that doesn't feel right if you're watching this, and your family is currently navigating a probate or inheritance dispute involving a claim that feels, in some specific, hard-to-articulate way, not quite right. A previously unknown claimed relative, documentation that seems almost too perfectly assembled, a corroborating witness you have no independent way of verifying. I want to say something directly to you. Grief is not a reason to accept an uncomfortable claim's premise simply to make the discomfort end sooner. It is, understandably and humanly, a reason you might feel tempted to. Those are different things, and recognizing the difference, even while genuinely grieving, even while genuinely exhausted, matters enormously to protecting both your own family's rightful inheritance, and, as this story has shown, potentially protecting other families down the line from a scheme that thrives specifically on each individual family's isolated, uninformed decision to quietly settle rather than investigate. Pursue definitive verification. Don't let a plausible-seeming narrative, however emotionally compelling or superficially well-documented, substitute for the kind of independent, professional scrutiny that a family in a less disoriented, less grief-stricken state would naturally apply. And if you do successfully uncover a fraudulent claim, consider, seriously, what accountability you might be able to pursue on behalf of whoever comes after you in this specific, exploitative pattern. Because as my family's investigation revealed, the person constructing a fraud sophisticated enough to survive one family's grief-driven uncertainty is very likely counting on doing exactly the same thing to the next family, and the family after that, for as long as nobody stops them. My father built something real, over 40 years of honest, careful work. He deserved to have that legacy protected from a calculated lie, exactly as much as David, and I deserved to grieve him without that legacy being weaponized against us during the hardest months of our lives. My name is Rebecca Sorensen, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a claim, a dispute, or anything about your own family's inheritance that felt like it deserved closer scrutiny, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.